The day the DNA revelations surfaced began like any other, quiet and uneventful, until the news found its way into the hushed corridors of Washington. It wasn't a public announcement at first, but a whisper passed from one aide to another. Then, carried into the offices of those who thrived on secrets, the document, a set of DNA results, wasn't supposed to leave the private hands that held it. But in Washington, nothing remains hidden for long. It was Barron's DNA, and the numbers and markers on the page carried implications that would unsettle an entire family. For years, the Trump household had carefully curated its image, projecting a sense of control, order, and unity despite political storms. Yet this single document threatened to undo that illusion, and its shockwaves were felt most powerfully by Melania, who discovered the leak not through a trusted confidant, but through the blunt persistence of the media. Donald Trump, known for his ability to brush off scandal with bluster and denial, was unusually quiet when the first questions reached him. He didn't rage or attack the source immediately. Instead, he retreated into private conversations, asking repeatedly who could have accessed the records, who would dare to circulate them, and why this was happening now. His usual armor of confidence seemed dented, as if he understood that this wasn't just another headline that could be fought with rhetoric. DNA was different. It was science, numbers that spoke without bias. And once they became public, they couldn't be debated in the way he was accustomed to handling controversy. Melania, however, didn't respond with silence. Those who were present at the time said her reaction was immediate and fiery, unlike the calm and controlled exterior she often displayed. To her, the revelation wasn't merely a political liability, it was a violation of privacy on the deepest level. She had spent years shielding Barron from public scrutiny, ensuring his name stayed away from the constant spotlight that followed his father. Now, in one reckless leak, Barron had become the center of the most personal and invasive scandal yet. The fury that poured out of Melania wasn't only directed at whoever had exposed the results, but also at Donald, who she accused of allowing their private lives to become collateral damage in his endless pursuit of power. The ripple effect was immediate. Reporters flooded the airwaves, their voices cautious yet buzzing with the undeniable weight of the story. Some speculated about how the results came to light, while others dissected what they meant. The public was divided. Some felt sympathy for Barron, arguing that he had been dragged into something far beyond his control, while others focused on the potential impact this had on Donald Trump's credibility. What was undeniable was that the Trump family's most closely guarded boundary had been breached. Behind closed doors, Donald struggled to regain his footing. He tried to minimize the damage, calling advisors and strategists, but even they knew there was little room to spin something so scientifically rooted. Instead, they urged him to focus on damage control and to stand beside Melania publicly, projecting unity in the face of exposure. Yet those closest to the family knew that unity was fractured. The shouting matches behind the walls of their residence revealed a family in turmoil. Melania's words cut sharp, filled with resentment for the years of sacrifices she made only to see her son's name tossed into political warfare. In private conversations, Donald reportedly told aides that this was an attack designed to wound him through his family. He insisted the leak was orchestrated by his political enemies, determined to destabilize him at a critical moment. Whether or not he believed that entirely, he repeated it enough to make it his shield. But even as he tried to externalize the blame, the truth lingered. This was a revelation that could not be undone. The DNA results existed, and the world knew about them. Melania spent the following days trying to protect Barron from the fallout, limiting his exposure, ensuring he didn't read the endless headlines dissecting his identity. Her anger remained raw. Her trust eroded not only in those around her, but in the very idea that privacy could still exist in their lives. For her, this wasn't just another scandal. It was a deeply personal wound that struck at the heart of her role as a mother. For Donald, it was another battlefield, one he hadn't anticipated, one where his usual weapons of deflection and denial fell short. And for Barron, unknowingly placed at the center of this storm, it was the moment when the private world his mother had so carefully built around him cracked wide open under the relentless weight of public scrutiny. When Representative Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, she did so with a composure that immediately captured attention. In her hands was a folder, thin but heavy with significance, and the eyes of the press fixed on her as she prepared to speak. For months, she had been hinting at irregularities, pointing out inconsistencies in the stories surrounding the Trump family. But when she finally stood before cameras, she wasn't speaking in riddles. She was direct, deliberate, and careful. With every word, she didn't raise her voice, nor did she indulge in theatrics. Instead, she allowed the evidence in her possession to speak for itself, making sure everyone in the room understood that this was about truth, not gossip. She opened by reminding the public that families of politicians often find themselves shielded from scrutiny, and rightfully so, as children should never be dragged into political fights. But then she pivoted, insisting that there are moments when secrecy becomes a tool for power, when private truths are manipulated to build public myths. It was then that she revealed the existence of Barron's DNA results, holding up the folder that seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension. The revelation was not shouted but laid out with the calm authority of someone who knew she had irrefutable facts. The murmurs in the room grew louder, reporters glancing at each other in disbelief, some already typing furiously into their devices as her words broke into headlines in real time. Donald Trump's name was mentioned repeatedly, not with the bluster he was used to commanding, but in the context of silence and secrecy. Crockett questioned why these results had been hidden, why a wall of protection had been built so tightly around them, and whether the concealment had been a matter of parental protection or political preservation. The distinction mattered, and she pressed it with precision. Her tone never drifted into malice, but the implication was clear. This wasn't about attacking a child, but about exposing how far Donald Trump was willing to go to preserve his narrative. Reaction to Crockett's exposure was one of immediate rage. She couldn't believe someone would dare bring Barron into the spotlight in this way. Yet Crockett anticipated that criticism, addressing it directly during her briefing. She said she understood Melania's position as a mother, understood the pain of having a private matter pulled into the public sphere, but she insisted that the greater issue was transparency, that when leaders use family as shields, the truth often becomes collateral damage. She didn't say this with cruelty, but with a conviction that suggested she believed this was necessary for the public to see clearly the lengths to which Donald Trump went to maintain control of his story. As her words spread across the airwaves, the impact was immediate and fine. News outlets replayed clips of her speech on a loop, dissecting her choice of words, her tone, her evidence. Analysts debated whether she had crossed a line by making Barron the center of her revelations, or whether the line had already been crossed long ago by the Trump family's own secrecy. What could not be denied was that Jasmine Crockett had shifted the conversation, forcing even Trump's most loyal supporters to acknowledge a revelation that could not simply be brushed aside. Behind the scenes, Donald was livid. He reportedly demanded that allies attack Crockett's credibility, painting her as reckless and opportunistic. But the calm, measured way in which she delivered her message made it difficult to dismiss her as a sensationalist. She hadn't shouted accusations, she had laid down facts, and facts carried a weight that even his fiercest defenses struggled to neutralize. In private, Melania accused Donald of failing to protect their son from becoming a pawn in political warfare. For her, Crockett's revelation was not just an attack from the outside, but a painful reminder that the world they inhabited would never truly allow Barron to live untouched by controversy. Donald, on the other hand, focused solely on how to counterpunch politically. He framed it as a coordinated assault against him, one designed to damage his standing and break his family apart. But even as he spoke in terms of enemies and strategy, the truth remained that Crockett had succeeded in making him vulnerable. By exposing the DNA results, she had illuminated the gap between the private world he tried to control and the public image he relentlessly projected. And for once, it wasn't a scandal about money, or politics, or his own behavior. It was something far more personal, and that made the wound deeper. Crockett's.com persistence resonated with those who were tired of half-truths and secrecy. Whether one agreed with her or not, her exposure forced the nation to confront questions that had lingered in the background for too long. Donald Trump, who had built a career on controlling the narrative, suddenly found himself in a position where the narrative had been taken out of his hands, placed into the steady voice of Jasmine Crockett, who had just changed the conversation in ways he could not easily undo. Inside the Trump residence, the atmosphere shifted from tense silence to explosive anger within minutes of the DNA results becoming public. Melania Trump, who had long endured the endless controversies tied to her husband, could no longer contain herself. The calm, measured exterior she typically displayed to the world cracked, and behind closed doors, her fury poured out in a way that stunned those around her. She slammed doors, raised her voice, and demanded to know how such intimate details about Barron could possibly escape into the hands of Representative Jasmine Crockett. For years, she had made Barron's privacy her highest priority, shielding him from the constant storms that followed Donald. But in that moment, she realized her efforts had failed. Her explosion wasn't just about the leak, it was about betrayal, about the years of sacrifice she had made only to see her son thrust into the ugliest of political crossfires. Donald Trump was caught off guard by the intensity of her reaction. He was accustomed to his wife's reserved manner, to her preference for silence when controversy arose. But this was different. She confronted him directly, accusing him of creating an environment where secrets could never stay safe, where even their child was vulnerable to attack. His instinct was to deflect, to insist that political enemies were responsible for orchestrating this exposure. But Melania wasn't satisfied with that explanation. To her, the issue wasn't just about who leaked the information, but why the information existed in the first place, and why she was learning about its public release at the same time as the rest of the country. Advisors close to the couple described the scene as one of the most heated arguments they had ever witnessed between them. Melania demanded accountability, insisting that Donald's relentless pursuit of power had finally gone too far. Her words cut into him, not because he agreed with her, but because they struck at a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He had always viewed scandal as a battlefield he could win, but this wasn't about him alone, this was about Barron. And Melania would not allow their son to be treated as another pawn in his endless war with critics. In the hours following the revelation, Melania's fury only grew as she read headlines that dissected her son's identity in cold, clinical terms. For her, each article was a knife, a reminder that the private world she had carefully built for Barron had been shattered. She stormed through rooms, shouting that she would never forgive the betrayal of being blindsided. Those close to her described a woman who felt trapped between loyalty to her husband and the primal instinct to protect her child. The explosion of anger wasn't just noise, it was the release of years of pent-up frustration, of watching Donald's actions ripple through their lives without consideration of the consequences. Donald, meanwhile, tried to calm the storm by promising to find out who was responsible. He paced the halls, calling aides and demanding answers. But his attempts to shift the focus to external enemies only fueled Melania's frustration. She told him plainly that no matter who leaked the results, the damage was done, and the responsibility ultimately rested with him. For once, he couldn't simply brush it off with bravado. The reality of her fury forced him into a corner, where his usual tactics of denial and deflection held no weight. The household staff spoke in hushed tones about the confrontation, aware that the Trump residence had become a battleground. Melania's voice, usually calm and quiet, carried through the walls with an intensity that left no doubt about her feelings. She was done with silence. She was done with pretending that the endless scandals were something she could tolerate as long as Barron was spared. Now that line had been crossed, and she made it clear she would not forgive or forget. Even in public, the cracks began to show. When Donald attempted to project confidence during brief appearances, Melania's absence was noted. She was no longer willing to stand beside him as if nothing had happened. The distance between them told a story on its own, one that aligned with the reports of her explosion behind closed doors. For once, the image of unity they had so carefully maintained was impossible to sustain. Donald continued to frame the leak as a political attack, repeating to his allies that enemies were using his son to strike at him. But in private, he was forced to reckon with Melania's wrath. She reminded him again and again that this wasn't just another scandal to be spun, it was their son's life, their son's identity, and her rage made it clear she would not allow him to treat it as a political inconvenience. The explosion was more than anger, it was a turning point, a moment where Melania's voice could no longer be contained, where her fury finally broke through the polished facade and revealed just how deeply fractured the Trump household had become. When the DNA story broke fully into the mainstream, the nation reacted with a mix of shock, confusion, and disbelief. Cable news channels ran the revelation on a loop, dissecting every angle, while online platforms erupted with theories, debates, and accusations. It was no longer just a private matter between Melania and Donald, and their sonette had become a national spectacle. Across the political spectrum, the fallout was immediate. Supporters of Donald Trump scrambled to defend him, insisting that the leak was nothing more than a coordinated attack designed to discredit his family. Critics, however, seized on the story as evidence of the secrecy and manipulation they had long accused him of, and somewhere in the middle were millions of Americans who, regardless of their political stance, felt a deep unease about Barron being thrust into the harshest glare of public scrutiny. Donald himself tried to regain control of the narrative by dismissing the story as fabricated or exaggerated. He went before cameras, raising his voice, repeating that his enemies would stop at nothing, even targeting his child, to weaken him. He pointed fingers at Democrats, at the media, and even at former allies, framing the entire incident as proof that the establishment feared his influence. Yet the calm, methodical way Representative Jasmine Crockett had presented the information made it difficult for many to dismiss her words as a partisan stunt. While Donald thundered and deflected, her composed delivery remained etched in the public's mind. The contrast between their approaches left many questioning whether his outbursts were genuine outrage or desperate attempts to distract from the truth. For Melania, the national fallout was unbearable. The headlines that once would have focused on her husband now featured Barron's name in bold type, paired with clinical explanations of DNA results that should have remained private. She saw her son's face splashed across screens, dissected not as a young man but as a symbol in a broader political war. The anger she had unleashed within the residence turned into a quieter, sharper grief as she realized how quickly the story had spiraled out of her control. She confided to close friends that she could hardly recognize the life she was living, that every effort she had made to shield Barron from the chaos of politics had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Observers across Washington couldn't ignore the shift. For years, Melania had been viewed as a reluctant participant in Donald's world, someone who endured rather than embraced the constant storm. But now her distress was visible in her absence. She chose not to appear beside him at events where she usually would have been expected, and that silence spoke louder than any statement she could have made. Insiders whispered that her absence was not just about protecting Barron, but but also a sign of her fracture with Donald. The carefully maintained image of unity was breaking apart before the nation's eyes, and everyone noticed. Meanwhile, Barron himself became an unwilling figure in a political storm he had never asked to join. Though Melania tried to shelter him from the coverage, the endless cycle of speculation made that impossible. Commentators debated what the revelation meant for Donald Trump's credibility, as though Barron's life were nothing more than a political talking point. In classrooms, households, and workplaces, people whispered about him, turning a deeply personal matter into a topic of gossip. For Donald, this was another reason to lash out. But for Melania, it was further proof of how devastating the fallout had become. The division within the public was stark. Some sympathized with Melania, recognizing her pain as a mother, watching her son dragged into something he could never control. Others argued that the secrecy surrounding the Trump family had invited this kind of exposure, that the DNA revelation was not an isolated issue but a symptom of years of hidden truths. The debate spilled into every corner of American life, dominating conversations in Washington and beyond. Through it all, Donald maintained his defiance, insisting that the attack on his family was proof of his strength and importance. He told crowds that if his enemies were willing to target his son, it meant he was winning. Yet even as he tried to project resilience, the cracks in his own household betrayed a different reality. Melania's fury and Barron's unwanted thrust into the spotlight painted a picture not of strength, but of a family unraveling under the relentless pressure of politics. The fallout wasn't limited to the Trumps alone. It reshaped the national conversation, forcing Americans to reckon with the blurred lines between private life and public power. Donald's name had been linked to countless scandals before, but this time, the storm centered on the people closest to him, those he claimed to protect, and no matter how loudly he spoke, no matter how fiercely he pointed fingers, the image of Melania's absence and Barron's name in the headlines told a story that could not be erased. The fallout had made one thing clear: this was a wound that reached deeper than politics, striking at the very heart of the family he had always claimed to defend. The story of Barron's DNA revelation did not end with a single news cycle or a fleeting scandal. It lingered in the air like an unhealed wound, reshaping how people viewed not only the Trump family but the fragile boundaries between private lives and public power. For Melania, the ordeal marked a breaking point. She had always walked a fine line between loyalty to her husband and the quiet protection of her son, but this moment showed her just how little control she truly had over the world they lived in. No matter how fiercely she fought to preserve privacy, the constant pull of politics had found a way to drag Barron into its unforgiving spotlight. Donald, by contrast, saw the revelation as another battle to be fought, another arena where he could frame himself as a victim of relentless enemies. He used the exposure as fuel, telling supporters that his opponents would stoop to any level, even targeting his child. For him, the fallout became a tool to rally his base, to remind them that he was under attack because he posed a threat. Yet beneath that bravado, those closest to him noticed a shift. The confidence that usually defined him seemed tempered by the reality that this scandal had struck closer to home than any before. This was not about a business deal, an election, or a courtroom. It was about his own household. For Jasmine Crockett, the decision to expose the results was more than a political maneuver. She framed it as an act of accountability, a stand against secrecy and manipulation. Whether one agreed with her or not, she succeeded in forcing a conversation about transparency at the highest levels. She reminded the public that even those who command great power are not immune to scrutiny, and that sometimes the truths they hide say more than the words they speak. Her calm delivery contrasted sharply with the chaos that followed, and that contrast gave her credibility in the eyes of many Americans. The nation's reaction remained divided. To some, Melania was a figure to be pitied, a mother watching helplessly as her son was thrust into a storm he never asked for. To others, she was complicit in the very world that had now betrayed her. Her silence over the years interpreted as acceptance. Barron, meanwhile, became a symbol in a debate that was never his to join. His identity dissected in ways that robbed him of the anonymity his mother had so carefully guarded. What became undeniable was that the Trump family could no longer present the same image of unity they once tried to project. The cracks were visible, the fractures impossible to hide. The fury inside the home, the distance between Donald and Melania, and the constant presence of Barron's name in the headlines revealed a family struggling to withstand the weight of politics turned personal. In the end, the story left behind more questions than answers. Who had leaked the results, and why now? What would this mean for Donald's future, both politically and personally? And perhaps most importantly, what would it mean for Barron, the young man at the center of it all, whose life had been altered in ways he never chose? The answers may never come clearly, but the impact was already undeniable. The DNA revelation was not just another chapter in the Trump saga, it was a turning point. A reminder that even the most powerful cannot keep every truth buried, and that when those truths surface, they carry the power to shake not only careers, but families to their very core.